Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Why fake a pregnancy? The question itself was enough to send shockwaves rippling through the Abbott mansion the moment Jack and Diane stumbled upon the truth that Claire Newman was hiding, a truth so elaborate, so painstakingly designed, that even the most cunning minds in Genoa City would have struggled to untangle it. And yet here it was, sitting like a loaded weapon in the palm of their hands. Because as Jack and Diane dug deeper into Claire's odd behavior, the late-night phone calls, the mysteriously guarded diary entries, the sudden excuses to leave family dinners early, and the way she clutched her abdomen with exaggerated subtlety whenever Kyle or Summer walked into the room, they began piecing together a puzzle that painted a picture so twisted and desperate it nearly took their breath away. And though Jack had seen his share of schemes over the decades, this one cut differently because it wasn't about power or money in the traditional sense. It was about love, obsession, validation, and a young woman trying to cement her place in a world that seemed to constantly remind her she was both Newman and outsider, an amalgam of legacies that never truly embraced her. And so she did what many broken souls before her had done in the heat of fear and desire. She fabricated a miracle, a lie masquerading as new life. A story that could tie her forever to Kyle and the Abbotts if only she could keep it going long enough for people to stop asking questions. And though Diane knew all too well the sting of desperate lies told in the name of belonging, her own past was riddled with them. She also knew that nothing good could come from a charade like this, because pregnancies end in deliveries, and fake pregnancies end in exposure. And exposure in Genoa City always led to destruction, broken trust, and headlines that could never be undone. So as Jack stood there clutching the damning evidence, a prescription bottle that didn't match Claire's supposed prenatal vitamins but rather a concoction used to mimic morning sickness and weight fluctuation, his heart sank with both fury and pity, fury that his son Kyle had been ensnared in yet another cycle of manipulation, and pity for Claire, who in her misguided attempt to hold on to love was about to lose it all. And while Diane's mind raced with questions, how long had this gone on? Who else knew? Was Summer aware? Was Victor pulling strings from the shadows to test her loyalty? Jack could only hear the echo of the unspoken answer to the question that had launched their horror in the first place. Why fake a pregnancy, unless you're so afraid of being abandoned, so terrified of irrelevance, that you'd rather build a fantasy than face the cold edge of truth? And that was the kind of fear Jack recognized in Claire's eyes every time she glanced around the Abbott living room. The kind of fear that didn't stem from malice but from trauma, a yearning to belong. And yet he also knew that when the truth exploded, and it always did, the fallout would scorch every bond she had fought so hard to keep. For Kyle's fragile trust would collapse like glass shattering on marble, Summer's lingering doubts about Claire's intentions would turn into vindication, Victor would see the scandal as leverage to reassert Newman dominance over Abbott pride, and Diane, of all people, would be left wrestling with whether she was willing to expose Claire or protect her in the name of redemption. Because Diane had once been the girl in Genoa City who faked, schemed, lied, and clawed just to keep a seat at the table. And now she was staring at her reflection in the form of a younger, broken woman repeating the cycle. And the weight of that realization hit her harder than she expected, leaving her torn between maternal instinct and moral obligation. And as Jack whispered through gritted teeth that they needed to confront Claire before this spiraled further, Diane placed a trembling hand on his arm and asked the only question that mattered in that moment: would exposing Claire destroy her completely, or could there still be a path to save her before she drowned in her own lie? Because in Genoa City, secrets rarely stayed buried, but sometimes, just sometimes, the way they came to light determined whether a soul was lost forever or found a second chance at redemption. The weight of the secret pressed heavier with each passing hour, and as Jack and Diane exchanged fraught glances across the Abbott living room, the silence between them spoke volumes. For they both knew that once you unearthed a lie this massive, there was no way to tuck it neatly back into the shadows where it had been conceived, no way to know what you had discovered, and so they were left grappling not just with Claire's deception but with the ripple effects it would unleash the moment truth collided with pretense, because Genoa City had never been a kind place for fragile hearts, and fake pregnancies were among the most dangerous lies a person could craft, for they created expectations, they demanded celebrations, they invited scrutiny, and they promised joy that could never come to fruition, which meant the longer Claire's charade continued, the more devastating the inevitable implosion would be. And Jack, haunted by memories of other schemes he had witnessed over the decades, could already envision the headlines, the whispers at society, the knowing smirks from Victor Newman when the Abbott name became entangled in yet another scandal born of desperation. And yet beneath all of Jack's righteous indignation was a nagging ache of sympathy, because he could not forget the look in Claire's eyes when she spoke of family, that wistful mix of longing and fear, as though every word she uttered carried the desperate plea of a child terrified of being sent back into exile. And Diane, for all her hardened exterior, felt that ache even more sharply because she recognized it as her own reflection, the same hunger that had once driven her to weave webs of deceit to secure her place among the Abbotts. And so here she was, standing decades later, watching another woman stumble down the very path she had once walked. And though it should have been easy to condemn Claire for her dishonesty, Diane found herself torn in a way that unsettled her core, because she saw the fragility beneath the lie, the trembling girl beneath the facade, and she wondered if exposing Claire would be justice or cruelty. And yet Jack could not abide silence, not when Kyle was unknowingly being drawn deeper into a fantasy destined to collapse, not when the Abbott legacy was once again being dangled over a pit of public ridicule, and his voice, low and determined, cut through the thick air as he told Diane they needed a plan, that confronting Claire recklessly could backfire, that she was already balancing on the edge of panic and exposure, and if pushed too hard, she might spin an even darker narrative to protect herself, perhaps accusing Kyle of betrayal, perhaps blaming Summer, perhaps dragging the Abbotts into a vortex of accusations that could poison alliances beyond repair. And Diane, who knew the cost of such spirals, warned Jack to tread carefully, for sometimes exposing a lie too harshly didn't liberate the truth, it destroyed the liar completely, leaving wreckage that could never be rebuilt. And as they debated in hushed tones, neither noticed that Claire herself was lingering just outside the doorway, her hands trembling as she clutched the hem of her sweater, her ears burning with every syllable of their discovery, her heart pounding as though it might burst through her chest, for she had not intended to eavesdrop. She had only come downstairs for water to quell the nausea she had induced with the pills she had been swallowing for weeks, but what she heard instead was her greatest fear made real. Jack and Diane knew, they had seen through her carefully constructed facade, and now everything she had sacrificed, every anxious night spent rehearsing the narrative of her pregnancy, every glance she had faked toward ultrasound photos pulled from the internet, every tear she had forced when speaking of morning sickness, it was all collapsing before her, and in that moment, she felt the crushing weight of inevitability, that no matter how tightly she clung to her lie, no matter how desperately she tried to wrap Kyle's love in the permanence of an unborn child, truth was about to drag her into the light, and the thought of losing Kyle, of being cast aside by the Abbotts, of giving Victor one more reason to sneer at her as an interloper, it made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe. And yet even through the panic, Claire's mind began to race, calculating, strategizing, searching for escape routes, because if there was one thing she had inherited from the Newman bloodline, it was the ability to pivot under pressure, to twist a narrative so convincingly that even suspicion could be redirected. And though the trembling in her hands betrayed her fear, her thoughts were already reaching for weapons she could wield, perhaps claiming a sudden miscarriage, perhaps weaving a tale of stress-induced complications, perhaps even pinning her deception on Victor's relentless pressure to prove her worth, because Claire knew that in Genoa City, guilt could always be shifted, stories could always be rewritten, and sometimes survival meant taking others down with you. But what she could not predict, what no amount of strategizing could shield her from, was the fact that Jack and Diane were not just adversaries. They were mirrors, reflections of her fractured soul, and the compassion brewing in Diane's heart might prove both her undoing and her salvation, for Diane could very well be the one person who might plead her case, who might soften Jack's fury long enough to keep the Abbotts from cutting her off completely, but that mercy would come at a cost Claire might not be willing to pay if it meant facing the shame of her choices. And as she retreated silently back up the stairs, tears burning her eyes, she whispered to herself the question she had once asked in a moment of lonely despair. Why fake a pregnancy? And the answer echoed back in her own hollow voice. Because when you've been abandoned enough times, when love feels conditional, when family is a prize you've never been fully allowed to hold, you will build whatever fantasy you must to keep from being left behind again, even if it destroys you in the end. And though Jack and Diane could not hear that whispered confession, they would soon feel its truth in every crack that spread through their family, in every betrayal that followed, And in every tear Kyle shed when he realized the future he thought he was building with Claire was nothing more than an illusion crafted by a woman too broken to trust love without chains. The storm had not yet broken, but Jack could feel it brewing in the marrow of his bones, that unmistakable hum of impending chaos that always seemed to find its way back to the Abbotts no matter how hard he tried to steer his family toward calm. And as he sat in his office at Jabot, staring blankly at contracts he couldn't bring himself to read, the image of Claire's trembling hands lingered in his mind, though he had only glimpsed them in memory and not in reality, because what haunted him was not just the lie itself but the fragile desperation beneath it, the same kind of fragility he had once seen in Diane before her many downfalls. And though his first instinct was to confront Claire with all the fire and authority of a patriarch defending his son, he found himself uncharacteristically restrained, held back by the quiet words Diane had spoken the night before, that sometimes the truth, if wielded like a blade, could kill instead of heal. And so he wrestled with a question that gnawed at him with every passing second. Should he rip the mask from Claire's face and let the chips fall? Or should he give her one last chance to come clean on her own, to offer honesty before deceit devoured her completely? And though Jack prided himself on being a man of honor, he also knew that silence in the face of deceit was complicity, and complicity was something he could not abide, especially when his son's heart was on the line, because Kyle, for all his flaws, had been battered enough by love and betrayal, and Jack could not stomach the thought of his boy being blindsided again, while Diane, who had spent the entire morning pacing their bedroom with the agitation of a caged animal, could not shake the conflict in her chest, torn between her instinct to protect a vulnerable young woman from implosion and her duty as both wife and mother to support Jack's quest for truth, because she knew better than anyone how unforgiving the world could be when a lie of this magnitude came crashing down. And as she rehearsed conversations in her mind, imagining herself pleading with Claire to stop the charade, picturing the anguish on Kyle's face when the truth reached him, and visioning Summer's vindicated smirk when she declared she had always been right about Claire, she felt the crushing inevitability of a disaster no amount of careful maneuvering could prevent, because in Genoa City, secrets were never just secrets. They were grenades waiting for the pin to be pulled, and Claire, whether she realized it or not, had already armed hers. And upstairs in the Abbott guest room, Claire herself was unraveling, pacing with wild eyes, her phone clutched tightly in her hands as though it might contain the answer to her unraveling world, scrolling through articles, searching for stories of women who had faked pregnancies and somehow survived the fallout, reading about miscarriages fabricated as convenient exits, about sudden relocations that erased scrutiny, about desperate cover stories that shifted blame to external forces. And as she absorbed those narratives, she crafted her own in her mind, one where she could pivot seamlessly into tragedy, claiming she had lost the baby through no fault of her own, painting herself as a victim of cruel fate rather than a manipulator of tender hearts. And she rehearsed the tears, the trembling voice, the hollow eyes that would sell the performance, because she knew that if she could make Kyle pity her, if she could make the Abbotts circle around her in compassion rather than judgment, then maybe, just maybe, she could keep from being completely cast out. But what she could not prepare for, what she could not even allow herself to consider fully, was the possibility that Kyle, upon learning of her deception, might never look at her the same way again, that the love she had fought so hard to secure would be poisoned forever, because love could forgive mistakes, but it rarely survived manipulation. And as she pressed her palm against her stomach, flat, unchanging, betraying the fantasy she had spun, her eyes filled with tears born not of performance but of grief, grief for the family she had always wanted but never truly believed she deserved, grief for the little girl inside her who had once begged for a mother's embrace, grief for the woman she had become, one so convinced that lies were the only way to hold on to love that she had shackled herself to an illusion she could no longer control. And meanwhile, Summer, ever perceptive, ever wary, had already begun piecing things together in her own quiet way, watching Claire with the sharpened eyes of a woman who had been burned too many times before, noting the inconsistencies in Claire's stories, the way her symptoms flared only when convenient, the way her doctor's appointments were always just beyond the reach of witnesses, and Summer's heart, though still tender from her own battles with Kyle, hardened with every observation, because she knew in her gut that Claire's pregnancy was not what it seemed, and though she had vowed to herself to step back, to avoid becoming entangled in Kyle's choices, she could not shake the instinct to protect him, to shield him from yet another heartbreak. And so, Quietly, carefully, she began her own investigation, calling in favors, checking names of doctors Claire had mentioned, comparing dates with schedules, and with each thread she pulled, the fabric of Claire's story began to unravel in her hands, and as she held the pieces of evidence that hinted at deception, Summer felt the dangerous thrill of vindication rising in her chest, because she had always warned Kyle that Claire carried shadows, and now, finally, she had proof she could deliver like a dagger, straight through the heart of Claire's charade. But even as she planned her next steps, Summer could not have predicted that Jack and Diane were only a breath away from their own confrontation, that Claire's secret was teetering on the edge of exposure from multiple fronts, and that when the truth finally broke, it would not be a quiet unraveling but a catastrophic implosion that would drag every Newman and Abbott into the flames, because in Genoa City, no lie ever stayed confined to the liar. It always bled into the veins of the families tied to it, poisoning loyalties, fueling vendettas, and changing destinies forever. The house itself seemed to hold its breath as if the walls were aware of the secret crawling within them, and as day bled into night, tension pressed down on the Abbott mansion so heavily that even Harrison, with his innocent laughter and boundless energy, seemed subdued, sensing the unease radiating from the adults who tried and failed to mask it, for Jack carried the weight of knowledge in his stiff shoulders. Diane wrestled with her conscience behind carefully chosen smiles, and Claire drifted through the halls like a ghost tethered to a lie, her every movement deliberate yet tinged with panic, as though she feared one wrong glance might shatter the fragile fantasy she had constructed. And in that silence, every sound became a threat. The ring of a phone, the knock at the door, the simple shuffle of footsteps, and Claire, locked within her spiraling thoughts, could no longer distinguish between real danger and the echo of her guilt, imagining at every turn that Jack's voice would suddenly cut through the air demanding the truth, or that Diane's eyes would harden with exposure, or that Summer would appear with damning evidence in her hands, because the walls of her story were closing in faster than she could reinforce them, and yet she pushed on with grim determination, rehearsing excuses, fabricating explanations, telling herself that if she could just survive the next few days, if she could just redirect suspicion or conjure the illusion of tragedy, she might still salvage the love she had bound herself to, though in the quiet corners of her heart she already knew the truth, that love built on deception was a house of cards trembling in the wind, and Kyle, blissfully unaware, continued to treat her with tenderness that sliced her deeper than condemnation ever could, his gentle questions about names, his hopeful musings about nurseries, his absent-minded touches on her arm as he imagined the life they were building, all of it twisting the knife of guilt until Claire could scarcely breathe beneath the weight of what she was stealing from him, and yet still she could not let go, because letting go meant facing emptiness, facing rejection, facing a world in which she was once again unwanted, and that was a fate she could not endure, not after clawing so far toward the promise of belonging, and while Jack debated timing, torn between the urge to protect his son and the recognition that exposing Claire too brutally could break her in ways she might never recover from.